My name is Mike Vogt. I'm a curator at the Iowa Gold Star Military Museum at Camp Dodge. And today's presentation is going to be on Fort Des Moines number 2, which existed in the area where present day Principal Park is and existed as a garrisoned Army post frontier fort from 1843 until 1846. In 1816, the U.S. Military, at the direction of national policy, extended its presence into what was called the Old Northwest Territory, made up of Wisconsin, Illinois, Indiana, Michigan, and Ohio, present-day states. We received that territory concluding at the conclusion of the American Revolution, and the British and the French still held a lot of sway in those areas. So the United States military, following the War of 1812, wanted to establish a more noticeable American presence in those areas, and they did so through the construction of various forts in the areas known as the Old Northwest. The Frontier Army missions at that time, primary missions: establish frontier posts and assert U.S. sovereignty, fly the flag. Oftentimes in the Northwest Territory following the American Revolution, U.S. troops on patrol would show up in an Indian village, and they were still flying the American flag even as late and after the War of 1812. So, U.S. troops would take the British flag down, put the U.S. flag back up. A few months later, they might enter the same village and find a British flag flying there. So it took a while to assert U.S. sovereignty into those areas. There was a lot of illegal trade that went on. There were traders that were authorized by the U.S. government, sometimes called factors, that would operate factories, not factories that produce things like we would think of today, but that compiled trade goods, and they would trade those items to the Native Americans. And there were other individuals that traded weapons illegally and liquor illegally. And part of the Army's mission on the frontier was to, in a number of ways, play policeman and make sure that those illegal trade activities were curtailed as much as possible. As former Native American or Indian lands were transferred by treaty and purchase to the United States government, a schedule was usually set up to remove Indians from those areas by a certain date. So another role of the Army on the frontier was to escort Indians out of territory transferred by treaty to the United States government. Also to enforce treaty borders. It was natural for Native American groups to want to return to areas where they had lived and hunted prior, and frontier European descendants and frontier European settlers oftentimes wanted to move into areas that were not part of United States territory. So again, the military frontier and the military on the frontier ends up playing policeman in that regard as well. Also to provide protection to Indians and settlers and the agents in the area, and also to explore and survey and establish travel routes throughout these areas as the frontier moved east to west. A young Lieutenant Colonel, Zachary Taylor, who would go on to achieve some fame in the Mexican War, wrote in 1840, quote, "The axe, pick, saw, and trowel has become more the implement of the American soldier than the cannon, musket, or sword." As you can see here, a map of Iowa in 1832. Iowa is open for settlement following the Black Hawk War in 1832, 1833. And so as settlers move across the frontier, they establish a number of forts: Fort Armstrong on present-day Rock Island, Fort Des Moines number 1 by present-day Montrose, and others up the Mississippi Valley, some established by the French that predate American settlement in these areas. In 1835, a group of U.S. dragoons marching out of Fort Des Moines number 1 on the Mississippi River down in southeast present-day Iowa went all the way up the Des Moines River Valley up into Minnesota, came back down, and one of the individuals that was assigned to that expedition was a Lieutenant Albert Lee, who was the namesake of present-day Albert Lee, Minnesota. He published a book the following year in 1836 called Notes on the Wisconsin Territory, particularly with reference to the Iowa District. the State Historical Society of Iowa in 1935 recognized Albert Lee as giving Iowa its name, although the origin of that name goes back to the Iowa Indian tribe. But he published some books. Some were lost in a steamboat. Most of them were lost in a steamboat sinking, but a few have survived. And the State Historical Society in 1935 reproduced that book on the centennial of its publication. But Lieutenant Lee wrote very, very flowing, very complimentary reviews of the flora and fauna to be found on the Iowa frontier. And one of his quotes was on page 11, "In every part of this whole district, beautiful rivers and creeks are to be found, whose transparent waters are perpetually renewed by the springs from which they flow." Lieutenant Albert Lee map from 1836. You can see there as they moved up from southeast Iowa, Fort Des Moines #1, traveled up through the Iowa Territory as it existed. You'll also notice that there were sections of Iowa that were a neutral zone to the north to separate the Sioux and the Sauk and Fox, and also the Potawatomi Indians. And so with each treaty, the shape of Iowa in territory form and later in state form evolves with each one of these treaties. The Dragoons, which were a light cavalry, did a lot of survey work throughout Iowa. Some of the present day highways and interstate paths in Iowa follow routes that were initially established by the Dragoons and then later became trail routes and travel routes utilized by the settlers as they arrived in Iowa. But on 11 October 1842, there was a meeting in Washington, D.C. Representatives of the Sauk and Fox tribe met with U.S. government representatives excuse me, and signed a treaty that would take effect 23 March 1843. And some of the major provisions is that the Sauk and Fox ceded the United States lands west of the Mississippi River, vacated areas east of the White Breast Line by 1 May 1843, and vacated the area west of the line 3 years after treaty approval. As a result, the Sauk and Fox would receive annually 5% of an $800,000 amount paid, and the U.S. would pay the tribe's debts that had been run up at the factors or with the local traders assigned to the different forts. And you can see the details here, what the Sauk and Fox received as far as monetary compensation and how that would be distributed to their tribes. To help patrol that area and make sure, as I had mentioned earlier, that settlers did not travel too far west and that the former inhabitants, the Native Americans, the Sauk and Fox, did not move back eastward into areas that had been transferred by treaty, they established Fort Des Moines at the confluence of the Raccoon and the Des Moines River. And as you can see from a drawing that was made in the 1850s, you can see the Des Moines River and the confluence there, the Des Moines River and the Raccoon River. And 2 units showed up, Company F of the 1st Infantry, and along with them was Company I, the 1st Dragoons, and they traveled up to that location and began constructing a fort in the summer of 1843. An example here, what the troops at those forts look like. An officer to the left, infantrymen about 1847, but the uniforms sort of looked the same. And number 2, or on the right side, an infantryman. And you'll notice that they're wearing white leather accoutrement straps. And then in the 1850s, they would convert those to black, as we're used to seeing images of Civil War soldiers. But at that time, it's kind of a unique embellishment. U.S. troops wore white leather straps to hold their accoutrements. On the right-hand side, you can see an image of a frontier dragoon of the type that would have occupied Fort Des Moines and gone out on various missions and patrols from Fort Des Moines throughout north and western Iowa. What you see here are, on the left, is an image that was made at the time of Fort Des Moines #1. The path of the Raccoon River, which you can see intersect about midpoint of the Des Moines River, would later, in the early 20th century, they would bring a bunch of fill in there and they would reroute that river. So the confluence of the Des Moines and the Raccoon looks different on these maps than you would expect to see it today. But the fort was made up of Officers' Row, which ran somewhat northwest to the west of the Des Moines River, and then the enlisted barracks ran at kind of an angle, almost like maybe a 70-degree angle to the northwest. And present day Martin Luther King Drive runs not far or cuts through the area where those barracks used to be, to give you a present day geographic reference point. But you'll notice here on this slide, you'll see that the Officers' Row is closest to the viewer in this perspective, and then the other row of buildings that points out to the upper left are the enlisted men's barracks. Other structures that were there was the factory, where the trade agents were. There was a civilian tailor that did a lot of work, repairing uniforms, sewing on buttons, things like that, amending uniforms and garments as needed. They had gardens. They farmed. They had one of the big activities throughout the existence of the fort was just maintaining the fort itself, rechinking the log structures that had been built, tending to the garden, guard duty, drill, etc. Oftentimes, a common question is, what are dragoons? As I said, dragoons are light cavalry, but they get their interesting name from a short-barreled blunderbuss, a musket carried by European light cavalry. And some were in the shape of a dragon. The muzzle end looked like a dragon's mouth, an open dragon's mouth. And so that particular weapon became associated with these light cavalry units, and they were sometimes called dragoons, or in the French, dragooners. Following the War of 1812, the U.S. dragoon regiments were eliminated, and during the Black Hawk War, they realized that cavalry units were a necessary part of the frontier army. And so they reestablished the dragoons in 1833, and the 2nd Dragoon Regiment was authorized in 1836. Fort Des Moines, commanding officer, Captain Edward Sumner, he commanded Company B of the 1st Dragoons, and they had a number of missions that departed Fort Des Moines over the years of his existence from 1843 to 1846. And oftentimes they were just simply to patrol, look for trespassers, Native American or European settlers or their descendants, and again, fly the flag and show a U.S. presence on the frontier. Another expedition, August 1844 to October 1844, the commanding officer was Captain James Allen, and he would spend some time in Des Moines even after the war, and he would later serve in the Mexican War, but he had some relatives here that were land speculators in Des Moines, so the Allen name was recognized in early Des Moines history. Again, a summer patrol ran about 2 months. Give you an example of what the maps looked like at that time. The 1844 expedition map survives. Has been located in the collection of the National Archives, but as detailed as this map might seem, without aerial reconnaissance that we would be used to today, or aerial photography, or today GPS, it was oftentimes the case where the names of rivers and streams and creeks were mistaken. One was mistaken for another, one was named one thing and it actually existed somewhere else. But such were the dilemmas of the frontier army. Another expedition, June 1845 to August 1845, Captain Allen again in command. Company B, 1st Dragoons, they marched to the Red River up in Minnesota to determine if a group that met us, who were a European descendant group, were crossing the border from French Canada to hunt into U.S. areas. So their mission was to prevent armed conflict between the Sioux and the Métis. This is a recreated map published in the Iowa Journal of History, April 1953, recreates the map of the last Dragoon travels through Iowa Territory in 1845. Again, each summer the Dragoons would conduct expeditions and deep into Indian country and north to the border of Canada to patrol and fly the flag. These expeditions were meant as a show of force to confront foreign traders operating in what was recognized as United States territory. During the Mexican War, which begins in April 1846, the dragoon regiments are pulled from Iowa, and they all see service in the Mexican War. So the artwork that you see here on the left and the right, on the left show dragoons during the Mexican War, and on the right as well. The success of the dragoons on the frontier and the need for larger cavalry forces during the American Civil War, which begins April 1861, the dragoon regiments were redesignated as cavalry during the early months of the Civil War. Some statistics here just showing a census of the territory taken in 1844. You can see how many individuals lived in the eastern counties in Iowa at the time that Fort Des Moines was in operation. So a total of about 75,000 settlers had already been in Iowa during a little over the first decade of settlement. So what happened to Fort Des Moines number 2 when the need for a frontier fort to patrol that area no longer existed? In 1846, the U.S. Army auctioned off some of the supplies, kegs of nails, flour, food, shingles, etc., and they were bought by the local inhabitants that had settled around the fort, and that would, of course, be the origin of the present-day city of Des Moines. You can see on the left there's an illustration showing the officers' quarters. The quarters are made up of two portions on one side and the other, with kind of a breezeway in between that they closed in to keep the wind and snow from blowing in between the two structures. On the right-hand side, you can see a photograph of the log officers' quarters shown in a photo from 1860, and you'll notice to the left you can see there's already a brick structure that is occupying some area near what had been the old officers' quarters. You'll also notice, looking at the drawing to the left and the photograph to the right, that one of those log cabins, one of those log barracks has been removed and either moved someplace else or taken off permanently, and there's only a portion of the original structure that remains. Another shot there showing Fort Des Moines number 2 officers' barracks remnant. In the early 21st century, when they were widening Martin Luther King Jr. Parkway in Des Moines, they did some extensive archaeological work, and they were successful in locating and establishing where the structures sat in relation to current day geography and current day modern features. But you can see there on the left a number of the different structures and buildings that comprise the Fort Des Moines complex. On archaeology, it is often said is the science of rubbish, and the archaeologists found things, of course, that were lost by the garrison at Fort Des Moines. And just a little sampling here. These things are on loan from the Office of the State Archaeologist in Iowa City and are currently on exhibit at the Iowa Gold Star Military Museum at Camp Dodge. But starting at lower left, you can see an eagle and wreath uniform button, 65 caliber lead infantry musket ball, Company F pewter hat insignia. Company F of the U.S. Infantry was assigned there, and we know that from historic records, but the archaeological record confirms that as well. Some fancier glassware. Officers tended to have fancier amenities in their existence at the fort, so these probably came from officers' quarters. Oftentimes they would dig latrine pits, outhouse pits, and broken dishes and glass oftentimes was dropped into those pits. Other times it's lost or tossed and awaits the archaeologist years later. Francis Paul Prussia wrote a great book, and the context of Fort Des Moines is aptly described in his work. And he wrote 1953, few American frontiers would have developed as they did without the presence near at hand of a military force. Wherever army posts were established in the wilderness, changes took place that may be attributed to the troops. The army cannot be assigned a single position in the parade to the west. Its presence was felt in all stages of the pioneering process. As I mentioned, officers served as ambassadors, policemen, farmers, carpenters, in a number of other in a number of other ways as well. If you're interested in learning more about it, some books that I would recommend: Journal of the First Dragoons in the Iowa Territory was published in the Iowa Journal of History. Other ones that are the Dragoons in the Iowa Territory, various articles. Fort Des Moines #1, an article in the Annals of Iowa discussed the archaeology that had taken place there at that time and would later on. I mentioned Francis Paul Prussia, Broadaxe and Bayonet. I think that's it's been reprinted since 1953. It's been in print for, I think, 70 years. It might be on its 7th or 8th printing. Let's see, Robert Utley, Frontiersman in Blue, kind of picks up where the Army left off after the end of the Civil War. I think that one covers the pre-Civil War era. And then a great book on all of the forts that existed in Iowa, even some built by civilians for protection against Native Americans, was edited by William Whitaker, and it's titled simply Frontier Forts of Iowa. And that's a great resource, and was a good resource for understanding the context and the role of Fort Des Moines present day.
My father moved his family from Mount Air to Fort Des Moines. And we arrived in Fort Des Moines in the West Gate the day that the last wax marched out of Boomtown. So I have a lot of knowledge about this fort. I think I've been in every square inch at one time or another. The bad thing is that history seems to have a way of going down the toilet. And I think the Fort Des Moines is a good example of that. Of all the history that took place in this, Reagan was here. It was just unbelievable. I have, again, probably my daughter will confess this, hundreds of stories. My father and mother opened up Campbell's Fairground Cafe in the old PX building. It was, like I said, I could just, every square inch. This was an apartment at one time, right after the war. That's probably why that plate marks on the floor, because all of that was subdivided. I have always had misinformation, but maybe you can help clarify. The fort was purchased. First, the fort was created by businessmen. They raised money to buy the property to create Fort Des Moines. And I think that's pretty well, if you get into the records, prove that. But the thing that I don't understand for sure, right after the war ended, then it became a civilian housing project. And I was led to believe in order for to be occupied by a veteran, either male or female, you had to have a minimum of 3 kids. Now, I can testify, this was nothing but wall-to-wall, lot line to lot line kids. I was one of them, and I had 2 brothers. And we lived over there in the wooden billets that was over here in the northeast part of the fort, where there was a bandstand. I think, did you reference that cabin that was, yeah, okay. When we moved in, that was a recreational area for the officers. They had barbecue pits, they had a big concrete bandstand, and they had a log cabin. Now, it wasn't 2-story, it was 1, but I think it was, had probably nothing to do with just an entertainment area. So, but we lived in the wooden billets that I later found out was also the 3 C's induction center. So if anybody can clarify some of my information, jump in on it, okay? But the 3 C's, you know, everybody know what the 3 C's are? Or were? Civilian Conservation Corps that Roosevelt put together. And Roosevelt was needing an army, so they deactivated the 3 C's because he had a ready-made army with those 3 C men that were working around the country and that. So anyway, those wooden billets were built for the 3 C's. It turned out my father was in the 3 C's, and he was, I know when we came in the gate, I remember him saying, God, I hope I get here in time because I know where I want my family to live. Well, I didn't know for years, but he was inducted in 3 C's, and he converted, him and a bunch of other returned servicemen, converted all those buildings to 3 apartments. One at each end, one in the center. And it turned out that that's where he was inducted. That's why he wanted to get there. And at that time, there was no sanitation facilities in the buildings. There were, I think, 3 billets, and then there was a central building at the east end that would accommodate all the personnel in the 3 buildings, had the laboratory, the showers, and all that. They tore all that out and put plumbing into these buildings. So I could go on for hours and hours, but I was just wanting some verification on a couple of facts. Did the city of Des Moines purchase Fort Des Moines at the end of the war? I was told it was, to make it legal, it was just like $1 or whatever, $1. So I just haven't had time to really research it to that end. And then the fact was, you had to have a minimum of 3 kids. And the middle apartment of the second building that was converted had 9 kids. Can you imagine 9 kids? The father fed those kids every day. He worked in Des Moines, and he would stop at the bakery. What was that? Was it Wonder? Bread? He would come home anyway with armloads of bread, and he fed those kids with French toast about it, 3 meals a day. There wasn't double bunks, there were triple bunks.
Any other questions?
Half of what was once Fort Des Moines is now city-owned Blank Park Golf Course and city-owned Blank Park Zoo. Like, it would make sense to me that that is true, but I don't know. I don't have any hard proof of that.
Well, I have a lot of this information in print.
Yeah.
But it's been proven, especially recently, that print necessarily can be weaponized to some extent. So that's why I was kind of wanting more clarification.
Yeah, absolutely.
It doesn't surprise me that they had a lot of people living here simply because when the American economy and industry focused for 3.5 years on the war effort, it was hard to get pipes and plain lamps and the things that you would use to build a home and fixtures. And so there was a chronic, you got all these GIs coming home that left when they were 18 and now they're back 19, 20, 21. This was the time you could get married and start a family. There was a chronic housing shortage across the nation. And so they had places, well they had, like for example, they had Quonset hut buildings on the campus at Iowa State for student housing, and everybody was looking for a place to live.
Iowa for a long time. Even like the 80s, it was there.
Well, first, I want to thank Mike very much for your time this morning. Appreciate learning more about Fort Des Moines number 2. As a kid who grew up like 4 miles from this spot, I knew nothing about anything historically significant happening at Fort Des Moines number 3, and I knew absolutely nothing of any significance about Fort Des Moines number 2. And which is why we do what we do, both as a museum here at Fort Des Moines number 3, and in bringing in speakers like Mike to talk about Fort Des Moines number 2, is to make sure that those stories are shared, to make sure that those stories are out there for people to connect with and learn more about. If you're interested in learning more stories, a couple options for you. You can tell we have filmed this session. We have filmed the other engagements that we've had in the Athene Speaker Series. So if you want to go on our YouTube page, just go to YouTube and put in Fort Des Moines Museum and click on our page and you will find the other Athene speakers. You will find short video clips that are sort of a tour of this museum, and you will find 2 short films, one about the African American officers here in 1917 and one about the WACs in World War II. Both of those are available for you to view and learn more of that information.
Sorry.
Go ahead.
As a reference, you said the Athene series. There might be folks in the audience.
Oh.
What
So,
was it?
Athene, you want to speak about Athene?
Sure. Athene is an insurance company in West Des Moines, and we had an interest in the building. I work with military veterans organization group, and so we had an interest in the museum. Jeff came and spoke at our Veterans Day breakfast that we hold each year last year, and then it turned into a partnership of bringing in speakers to tell the stories, like Jeff said.
And so their funding is what allows this speaker series to happen. It allows us to pay for the marketing. I know, I'm guessing many of you, some of you heard about this on Iowa Public Radio. That's because of the team's generosity that we were able to put that marketing out there, that we were able to bring in speakers from outside the metro and pay for their travel costs and things like that. And we have one more in this particular series. It will be Saturday, November 18th, also at 11 o'clock in the morning. And we're trying to tie a bow on our series. So we're going to do an interview, actually, not a presentation, with a gentleman by the name of Eric Ngagne. Eric is originally from Africa. I can't remember what country specifically right now.
Tanzania.
Thank you, Tanzania. And Eric is the creator and host of a podcast called the Iowa Civil Rights History Podcast. And he goes around and interviews individuals who, like the Fort Des Moines Museum, are telling stories about folks who fought for civil rights, whether that's racial civil rights or gender civil rights or any number of other topics. A number of the folks that he has interviewed have direct connections to Fort Des Moines. Edmund Griffin's son, Stanley, was an interview person. James Morris's grandson was on the podcast. And so Eric and I are going to sit down and just have a conversation about what he's learned generally about Iowa's role in the civil rights movement, Fort Des Moines' role specifically in the civil rights movement, and talk more broadly about some of the themes that we work with here. So that is Saturday, November 18th at 11 o'clock. You're welcome to sit down and join. Eric and I have not decided whether it's up to Eric. If it's going to be a simulcast, if there will be both a video version and a podcast version, that's up to him. It's his podcast. But we'll have that for folks as well. With that, thank you all for coming. Appreciate your time. If you have more, yeah, what?
Just wanted to mention
Oh,
about
yes,
massing of
go.
the colors. Massing of the colors.
Yes, please do.
So on the 4th of November, we have a Massing of the Colors event, which is going to be at the Franklin Junior High Event Center. And basically it's to kick off Veterans Day, where we'll have kind of this patriotic celebration to thank those that have served in the past, that are serving now, and serving in the future. We kick it off at 8 a.m. with a pancake breakfast that's free for everyone by Chris Cakes, which I heard has delicious pancakes. And then we also have color guards, at least 12 different groups being represented. We have several police departments, the West Des Moines and Des Moines Fire Departments, VFW, they'll all be doing various, with their flags, doing part of that ceremony. We have Captain Edward Gant, who is a retired Navy captain, who will be coming to speak. We have the Highlander Bagpipes, we have a couple of Urbandale Community Choir, Kansas City Boys and Girls Choir. So anyway, it's going to be quite an event celebrating this, and would love to have all of you there, as I mentioned. We also have information at massingofthecolors.org where you can RSVP, and I'd love to give you some flyers if you want to take one and join us and share it with others who might want to attend.